Hi, welcome to a very, very special episode of Agenda Awani, especially recorded on the sideline of a very, very important conference, the Global IP Valuation Conference 2013. And I have with me today two experts. They have been around the world. Closest to me is Mike Pellegrino of Pellegrino and Associates. It's so easy to read up about Mike. You just go to his website and there's a lot of things. And I think he's written tons of papers on the issue of intellectual property. And then I also have Associate Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusso, Senior External Fellow of World Trade Institute and Senior Fellow of UKM. But Associate Professor Dr. Sufyan has been around the world, been in Europe, looking at intellectual property. And I guess today, the theme for the global IP evaluation is maybe unlocking the mystery of intellectual property. Maybe in Malaysia it's still a mystery. When I look at what Mike and his group of colleagues over there at Pellegrino Associates, they've been looking at so many things over so many years. But suffice to say that if we were to be there in 2020 as a developed nation, then knowledge economy is a key thing about that, and innovation is integral. But how do we look at both of that and link it to IP or intellectual property? So I'm going to start with Mike first, because I remember we have the multimedia super corridor, a very gung-ho concept to bring knowledge economy in terms of ICT technology. But maybe at that time we were not really looking at intellectual property. However, in between that and now, there was this .com bubble burst, and that set a lot of people back a bit. But maybe if we can reset it, and you have great examples in your presentations before where valuation of companies during the .com bubble, for example, was way, way over what they should be. So maybe if you can paint the picture, because all the time we've been hearing about Facebooks and the hundreds of billions, and now we're looking at Twitter and how much that's going to be. So can you put a line of where we should look at in terms of the intellectual property and where Malaysia is heading?
Certainly. The lessons that one might derive from the original .com boom, 70% of those companies that filed for an initial public offering were bankrupt by the time the crash had finalized. So there are a lot of lessons that emerged from that experience. The first is that there was a lack of respect for fundamental valuation. Traditional cash flow modeling, which is a mainstay of valuation, was disregarded for newer valuation methodologies that might have been given greater emphasis in excitement and trying to drum up valuations and so forth. What we find is that those new methods did not have a foundation that was rooted in economics ultimately. So the number of eyeballs, for example, to visit a website. Companies used to be valued based on how many eyeballs looked at a website. And one of the lessons that came out of that experience was that eyeballs themselves are not valuable. It's the conversion of those eyeballs into some transaction that creates the value, which ultimately gets us back to a fundamental basis. So we have some IP. Its value, if it is indeed positive, has to generate economic activity at some point.
So are we at the stage, especially from your experience looking at Malaysia, where financial institutions, for example, are a bit grudging in the sense of valuing intellectual property? Because, for example, if we want a lot of new ICT companies to go up, so ideas in the form of IPs needs to be recognized as assets. Then maybe they can use that to get financing and funding. But maybe that's still the problem in these parts of the world as compared to America.
I would offer that as a problem in America as well. I like what Malaysia is putting together, because in some ways other countries, America itself, can learn from the initiatives that are occurring here. IP is a remarkable asset. It drives more than $5 trillion of the U.S. economy in particular, and some IP assets are worth more than entire companies. So a patent on a pharmaceutical, for example, might be worth more than a company in the S&P 500. And we find banks are unwilling to loan on those type of assets for several reasons. There is a lack of information associated with IP. So discovering what that value is a very laborious process. Yes. Versus, let's say, a house or a used car where
yes.
it's fairly easy to find a liquid market because yes. there's good disclosure of all of the transactions. So we don't have that in many different locations. So it's difficult to understand the market interest in that property yes. and whether there is some residual value associated with it if the loan were indeed to default. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is that the accounting standards traditionally have a cost focus.
Okay.
And cost and value are disjoint concepts. Cost is what you pay
yes.
for an asset, but that's not the value of it. So if I buy a cash register for my coffee shop, the value of the cash register is not, say, $100 US, yes. what I might pay for it. It's how much labor savings do I get
yes.
by being able to better manage my transactions
yes.
and my inventory. Those are things that are many multiples more valuable than the $100 I pay. So the problem is with IP, many times it's difficult to measure that directly and find a market of willing participants that are willing to buy that asset after it occurs.
Okay. If I can go to Associate Professor Dr. Sufyan, you've looked at world trades and Malaysia is currently negotiating a lot of trading agreements, for example, you know, from FTAs to TPPA, for example. And IP is one of the cornerstone of all this negotiation because at the same time we want to be there in the free market of global trade, but there are specific strategic interests domestically that we also want to protect. And maybe overall the consciousness of the locals here about intellectual property is maybe not as mature as maybe in the developed nations. So how do you look at IP as an asset for this country moving forward?
There are a few observations that I make. Number one, the intellectual property is not well understood by a lot of people in the country. Those who are involved in knowledge-based economy, such as ICT, biotechnology, probably now green technology, they are starting to understand the importance of intellectual property. But in the early days, not that long ago, probably in the 90s, for example, people were not that aware about the IP. Number one, IP was an afterthought in the business planning. Okay. So you have a business plan, but you do not include IP registration and IP, the annual fees to sustain the IP in the business plan. And so when it becomes an afterthought, then it's always very difficult to go back and start thinking about the IP.
Yes.
And number two, we have a problem of differentiating different IPs. People think like, okay, IPs is actually only one type of IP, but it's actually different types of IP. So that requires an understanding that, look, this is actually a design, this is actually a patent, it's a copyright, a trademark, and how to actually manage the whole bundle of intellectual property.
Associate Professor, I have to cut you there because I have to go for the first break. But once we are back, I'm going to give you the first chance to speak, because if you can take the points that you've been making and put it on one key problem that we have in this country, we have lots of resources diverted into research and development, R&Ds, especially in our institution of higher learnings. But if we compare that to commercialization, monetization, or even just putting out these innovations out there in the market, there's a huge, big gap. Maybe if we single out the role of IPs, maybe we can help bridge that gap. What's your views on that based on your travels around the world in Europe and other places? We'll discuss that after this short break. Thank you for still watching a very special episode of Agenda Awani, recorded at this very special conference, the Global IP Valuation Conference 2013. And I'm going to go straight to the point where we want to go to full-fledged into the knowledge economy. We want to look at R&D and bring ideas as products and services into the market. There's a still big gap in this country of making that happen. But if I remember correctly, Silicon Valley wouldn't have existed without what Stanford did, for example. And you know, that's, I mean, we just look at Silicon Valley now, and we know a lot of brands that come out from there, the technologies and even the technopreneurs. But if you look at this country, Associate Professor Dr. Sufiat, can we use IP, the understanding of it, the mechanism of it, to help bring ideas better to the market?
Okay, there are few factors that we can use intellectual property to bring products and services into market, to help the products to enhance their presence in the market. But first, before we do that, first we need to increase the R&D per capita expenses.
Okay.
At the moment, we have probably less than 2% of our R&D per capita over the GDP. And our R&D as a nation, our R&D spending as a nation is very small, and it's smaller than one of those big pharma companies.
Yes.
So it's very small. So we have to get not just the government. We have been relying on the government, but we need companies to start looking on R&D. And then number two, we have to look at bridging the relationship between the universities and the industry.
Okay.
That's where you can actually bring your intellectual property one step higher, because you know that the moment you work on something, that you get an intellectual property, you know the industry will assist you in bringing into the products into commercialization. This is very important. At the moment, we are we are starting to get there, but working in silos still. Number three, we have to get the universities to work together.
Okay.
So this is what happened in Europe and the States and some other countries, where all universities tend to share research facilities. They tend to share the expertise, the brains, rather than having one university working on one particular product without others knowing.
And duplications.
And and duplication of resources.
Even when I went to the Nobel laureate ceremonies, I mean, one Nobel prize is not just one person anymore nowadays. It's a multi-stakeholder partnership, because you just can't have a breakthrough if you're just looking at it in silo. But Mike, I'm sure you've come across universities also and looking at how they bring out products and services.
We do a lot of work with the universities. We find an interesting tension between the universities and commercialization of IP. So the academician is going to want freedom to research an area of interest to them.
Okay.
Now, when you look at where they're performing their research and the patents that emerge from that, and then you look at what is hot in development in the market, there's a mismatch. So the hottest areas in the U.S. for technology development are in telecommunications.
Okay.
Most universities, the greatest area of patent production is in drugs.
Okay.
So there's this tension where the university is producing a lot of IP that is not as relevant to what the market is saying I need. And that really strikes at the efficiency ratio for a university in terms of monetizing its IP assets. A commercial entity is going to be better matched usually as far as producing IP that is meeting a particular problem they're trying to solve. Many times it might be the foundation of the company in the first place.
So if we look at it, for developed countries, you have bigger companies that can come up with that, like big farmers, like what Associate Professor said. But for developing nations, a lot of the R&D resources still lie with the public sector, with the government and government-related institutions. So what would your advice be for countries like Malaysia, especially moving forward? Because if you were asking for the government to be ahead or at the same line in the market with private sector, that's a bit difficult. But what would be the middle ground that we can look at as a model?
Well, I think there are two things that are important. One is a support for development of these ideas through capital. So financing sources is an important part of that. But you can throw a lot of money at poor technology. And at the end of the day have something that's not economically viable. So the other thing that you need is a good infrastructure to foster that idea development and maturity, the experience that's going to help somebody take a really good idea and bring that to market. And the last is you need to be willing to fail.
Okay.
So when I started my firm 10 years ago, it was not the first time I started a business, but it was the first time I was successful.
Okay.
And I learned something out of those prior failures that each time that was beneficial in that, that new company that I was forming at the time. So that's an important part. And there are a lot of smart people here, there's no doubt about that. It's a question of making sure that they have the right direction and resources to capitalize on that without penalty or reputation impairment because, well, I tried this and it didn't work.
Don't punish them for that.
Yes.
Associate Professor Dr. Sufyan, is it the ecosystem that we're looking at? Because if you look at the Scandinavian countries, it's the whole setup of society, public sector and the private sector is geared, they are geared towards that. You know, we don't see it directly, but when I was looking and studying what they did, like paternal leave for a father, it doesn't have to be the mother who after birth have to go home. If the mother wants to continue and pursue the ideas to bring out great services and product, so the father can stay at home. The whole society is geared towards innovation because they know that that's the competitive edge. But for Malaysia, where do you think we can go and how do you think we can do that?
Okay, I think one of the most important thing to see is to look at intellectual property as part of product ecosystem.
Okay.
So it's from the inception of the idea to the end consumer, either domestic market or in the international market. So we have to take into account in the ecosystem, in the whole value chain of the production, there are IPs along the ways. So the moment you do something, there are bound to be IPs. So there are bound to be innovation, improvement. And there are two things which I would like to say. One is the individually owned IPs, owned by startups, owned by companies. And there's another one which we can encourage innovation at the local level, which is communal intellectual property, like collective trademark, geographical indications. This type of intellectual properties will assist communal innovation, communal intellectual property development, communal business, and those who can afford it, those who are like in the SMEs and the multinationals, they can work on the individual IPs. So we have to look at IPs as a whole sum rather than individually.
Okay, I have to go for the last break, but once we are back, developing nations doesn't have as much resources as developed nations or even big companies, whether it's big pharmas or the big oil companies or defense companies. So we have to choose where we want to park our resources and build the ecosystem. So I'm going to tap into the expertise of both gentlemen to suggest where can we go on this, because it's a very interlinked market nowadays globally. And I'm still delving through half of what TPPA debates are all about, because there's a big component also about copyright, patents and stuff in there. But at the same time, how do we make the best out of intellectual property rather than look at it as very antagonistic, as very defensive? Because maybe when we look at Apple and Samsung going at war, maybe 1 billion or 2 billion for Samsung is nothing. They can still produce a lot of new innovations. But if they hit us with that amount of penalty, we're just going to suffer. So where do we tread? What do we choose? Both gentlemen will share their thoughts after this break. The Global IP Evaluation Conference. If you have missed the conference, this is the post-discussion on air, recorded especially at Mandarin Oriental, and thanks to my IPO. But I want to go straight to Associate Professor Dr. Sufyan. It looks like if we look at just big things, the big pharma, the big oil companies, if we look at their registered patents, the Samsungs and the Apples of the world, we look like we are very, very small and we're nowhere. We're not even significant. But if we look at our own strength and we look at the whole concept of IP, maybe we can adapt it to our own ecosystem and bring out products and services from the local wisdom of areas that we know well, for example.
Okay, like I mentioned earlier, there are two types of IP, individual IP and communal IP. So individual IP is normally developed by SMEs, by companies, multinationals, and we are net importer of that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we have an opportunity to develop local and communal products through IPs, which is called geographical indication in our country. So we have local products, for example, labu sayong, batik, silk, some local food. This can be developed, and then you can. I take this example from my work in least developed countries, in Laos, in Cambodia. So we develop a local community, an association, an IP association, where they own the IP, they register the IP, and then they will license out to individuals with different brands and trademarks, but they pay the license to the local community owner of the original GI. So then we assist those owners to access foreign markets. Before they access foreign markets, we make sure that they have the proper packaging and compliance with the international standards. So that's how we ensure that with IP you are nothing, but with IP and more innovation in between, with marketing and capital and market access, you will be able to get there.
How do you bring that awareness? Because what's to stop the bigger guys from coming into a local area like Laos, Malaysia, or wherever else, and then just doing that before the community can do it?
No, because this is heritage products.
Okay.
So we have a lot of heritage products in Malaysia. In order to apply for geographical indications, you have to show your association to the geographical area. So from there, say for example in Terengganu we have batik, in Perak we have labu sayong. So these two products, we can get the local community to develop their local association, they register the IP, then it will go down to the next layer.
Okay, that's one way, positive side at least in this discussion. I want to go to Mike before we end, and we remember the episode of the basmati rice in India, for example. And also in India, also we saw the fight between the generic drugs and the non-generic and the big pharma and the government. So it can go bloody in that sense, in the IP battle. And we've looked at Samsung and Apple. So how do you look at all that? Because that might skew a lot of people's opinion, especially laymen. But from looking at IP as an asset to build wealth to a potentially contentious one.
And the headlines are around Apple and Samsung, but they're a fraction of the more than 1 million patents that are granted around the world on an annual basis. What we find is incredible opportunity. Wealth of nations used to be driven by land and resources and military strength, and we don't find that that's necessarily the discriminating factor anymore. Good ideas can be. In my hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana, we have Eli Lilly, which is a $20 billion company. There's another company in that town that was a drug company. It was 12 employees, very smart people. They developed a drug. It had some patents that were associated with it, and it sold for near $300 million.
Okay.
12 people.
12 people.
So we're not talking about ideas that require the level of capital to build a cell phone that's going to sell 80 million units a year. You can have very good ideas that are very valuable with a core team. So a key concept does not require necessarily a lot of infrastructure. Just somebody who looks at the world slightly differently and sees, wow, I see a problem here, and an ability to solve that in an objective way that's going to create value, lower cost, better efficacy. If you're solving a real-world problem, the door will be beat down by people trying to gain access to that.
So we wouldn't be seeing trade wars, for example, in all these negotiated FTAs or whatever else, because we've seen how big companies, they just buy smaller companies because they want actually not the people, but the IPs in these companies.
It happens all the time. We look at a lot of the Apple ecosystem was not developed internally to Apple. You'll find that many of the different companies that they've acquired over the years fill the basic functionality profile for an Apple device, whether it's gesture-based movements or iTunes or other operating system components, those were acquired over the years and then packaged in a way that was exceptional to the common user experience.
But you are very positive about what Malaysia is doing regarding intellectual property and the way we're moving forward.
Absolutely.
Okay. Associate Professor Doctor, before we end, your views on what positives we can move forward with?
First, we have to get more people to be aware that intellectual property is not the end,
Yes.
it's the beginning.
Okay.
Once you have an IP, you have to start looking into commercializing it,
Yes.
and then monetizing it, getting money into it, investment. So this is the whole value chain. We have to look at it from a total perspective rather than just IP in isolation of the rest of the
That's just a
activities.
seed. You need to grow it.
Yes.
You know, give it food, nourish
Yeah,
it, and
yeah.
make it grow bigger. That's all the time we have for now. Thank you so much to Mike. Thanks so much to
Thank you very much.
Associate Professor Dr. Sufyan. You can just Google them. There's tons of articles on Google about them. So I would like to thank my IPO for giving us the opportunity to talk about this very, very important topic for this country moving forward towards a developed nation status. I'll see you in another episode very, very soon. Goodbye.